If you ever find someone buried in mud on a forgotten outpost, don't touch them, the dock's supervisor had told Ethan once. Because the ones worth saving are never simple. 3 days into a dust storm that made the sky look like it had given up, Ethan Cole stood alone behind Maintenance Bay 4, staring at a shape half swallowed by red clay and silence that felt just a little too intentional. The outpost wasn't the kind of place where people asked questions. It was the kind where broken machines and broken stories arrived, got patched, and left without explanation. Ethan preferred machines. They lied less. He crouched, brushing aside layers of hardened mud with careful fingers, expecting the usual, scrap, debris, something someone had decided wasn't worth carrying anymore. Instead, his hand paused against something warmer than the air had any right to be. Well, he muttered under his breath, that's new. The figure was a woman, or close enough that his brain didn't feel like arguing. Her body curled slightly, as if she had tried to make herself smaller than the storm. Mud coated her from head to toe, thick enough to hide details, but not enough to hide the fact that she was breathing, faint and uneven, like a system running on backup power. Ethan glanced back toward the bay doors where a couple of workers had gathered. Watching from a safe distance like this was a problem that might escalate if observed too closely. You gonna leave her? One of them called. Storm will take care of it. Ethan exhaled slowly. That would have been the practical choice. Practical kept you employed. Practical kept you unnoticed. He had built an entire life out of practical. And yet his hands were already moving, clearing mud from her face, revealing skin beneath that didn't quite match anything he'd seen before. Not wrong, just different, like light reflecting off metal that didn't exist in any catalog. Yeah, he said finally, voice dry. I'm having a rebellious afternoon. Lifting her was easier than expected, which he decided not to overthink. And carrying her back into the bay felt like crossing an invisible line he would later regret crossing properly. The interior lights flickered as the storm pressed against the structure, the whole building humming like it was considering a career change. Ethan set her down on a maintenance table, grabbed a container of clean water, and began the slow process of washing away layers of red-brown mud. It came off in uneven sheets, revealing glimpses beneath, skin that held a faint, almost imperceptible sheen, like it remembered being something more than flesh. He worked methodically, because that's what he knew how to do, because focusing on small, manageable actions was easier than acknowledging that this was already far outside the boundaries of his job description. You picked a bad place to collapse, he said quietly, as if she might hear him. We don't even have decent coffee. As the water cleared more of her face, he noticed the subtle curve of her features, the way her expression remained composed even in unconsciousness. Like whatever she wasn't used to being helpless. His hand paused for a fraction of a second when he brushed near her ear, the shape just slightly too long, too elegant, tapering in a way that made his brain file it under alien, without ceremony. Okay, Ethan murmured, not particularly alarmed, just updating his internal notes. That explains a few things. Not which things, but some things. Outside, the wind howled harder, rattling the bay doors, while inside, the air seemed to settle around the table in a way that felt almost attentive. He didn't notice when the background noise shifted, when the usual clatter of tools and distant voices thinned into something quieter, more watchful. He only noticed the woman's hand when it moved, fingers curling weakly around his wrist with surprising precision. As if even half-conscious, she knew exactly where to hold on. Ethan froze, water dripping from his hand, and for the first time since finding her, he had the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that this wasn't a random accident at all, that somewhere far beyond this storm-battered outpost, something had just corrected itself, and he was standing right at the center of it. The moment her fingers closed around his wrist, the room seemed to notice, not in any dramatic way. Just a subtle shift, like the air itself had decided to pay attention, and Ethan, who had spent most of his life being ignored by everything that mattered, suddenly found that deeply inconvenient. He did not pull away, mostly because he had learned that sudden movements around unstable systems, whether mechanical or otherwise, tended to make things worse. Okay, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. That is new behavior. Her grip was not strong, but it was deliberate, the kind of contact that suggested awareness rather than reflex. and when he glanced down, he realized her eyes were no longer fully closed. They were open just enough to focus, not on the ceiling, not on the flickering lights, but on him, as if he had been the intended destination all along. There was something unsettling about that level of precision. Ethan had met people who looked at him before, usually to ask for repairs or complain about something not working, but this was different. This was not recognition exactly, but it was not confusion either. It was something in between, like she had expected to find someone and was now trying to confirm whether he matched the description. "You are going to need to blink or say something," he added after a second, maintaining his usual tone of dry practicality, because right now this is starting to feel like a very specific kind of problem. Her fingers tightened slightly, just enough to confirm that she had heard him, and then her lips parted, not to speak at first, but to draw in a deeper breath, as if the act itself required effort. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, and carried a cadence that did not quite align with the trade's standard language she used. "You should not be here," she said, each word measured, as if translated from something more precise. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a habit he had developed when situations refused to stay simple. "I get that a lot," he replied. "Usually from people who outrank me, which I am guessing you do, statistically speaking." There was a faint shift in her expression, something almost like disbelief, but it did not last long. Her gaze sharpened instead, scanning his face. With a focus that made him acutely aware of the small scar near his chin, the one he had stopped noticing years ago. "You did not leave," she said, quieter now, almost to herself. "That is incorrect." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "I have a long history of making incorrect decisions," he said. "It is practically a specialty." Behind him, the bay doors rattled harder, the storm pressing in with renewed insistence. But another sound began to layer beneath it, distant at first, then unmistakable, the low synchronized hum of approaching transports. Ethan recognized the sound immediately, because on a station like this, you learn to recognize the difference between routine traffic and something that came with authority. He glanced toward the entrance, then back at her. "If you are about to tell me that this is where things get complicated," he said, "I would like to officially note that things were already complicated." Her hand did not release him. If anything, her grip steadied, as if anchoring herself to something she refused to lose. "They will come," she said, her voice carrying a certainty that did not invite doubt. "And when they do, you must not let them take you away." Ethan blinked once, processing that, then looked at her again, slower this time. "I am sorry," he said carefully, "but I think you might have the roles reversed. I am the one who found you." For a brief moment, something almost like a smile touched her expression, not warm, not soft, but knowing in a way that suggested the situation was already far beyond his understanding. "Yes," she said, "that is why they will not allow it." The lights flickered again, and this time the entire bay seemed to hold its breath as the first heavy impact of landing engines reverberated through the structure, precise and controlled, the kind of arrival that did not ask for permission. Ethan glanced toward the doors as shadows moved across the narrow windows, sharp and organized, and then back at the woman who still held his wrist like it was the most important connection in the room. "Right?" he muttered under his breath. "This is officially above my pay grade." The bay doors did not open so much as decide to. Stop pretending they were in control, sliding apart with a precision that felt less mechanical and more authoritative, and the storm outside immediately took offense. Wind pressing in like it had been waiting for an invitation it did not deserve. Ethan did not move at first, mostly because the woman's grip on his wrist had not loosened, and also because experience had taught him that when heavily armored transports landed exactly on your coordinates, it was rarely for routine maintenance requests. The first figures stepped through the threshold in perfect synchronization, their armor smooth and reflective in a way that suggested it had never once been inconvenienced by dirt, their movements measured, efficient, and completely uninterested in the concept of hesitation. They spread out across the bay without speaking, forming a perimeter that subtly but effectively redefined the space as theirs. Ethan watched this with the quiet resignation of a man who had just realized that his afternoon had taken a very permanent turn. "I am going to guess," he said under his breath, "that these are not here to inspect my repair logs." The woman did not respond immediately, but her fingers tightened again, a small adjustment that carried more intent than force. "Do not speak unless I tell you," she said softly, her voice steadier now, the earlier weakness replaced by something sharper, more controlled. Ethan nodded once. "That feels like advice I should have received earlier," he replied, though he kept his tone low, respectful of the fact that the room had just filled with individuals who looked like they considered silence a professional skill. One of the armored figures stepped forward, stopping exactly 6 feet from the table, as if distance itself had regulations. For a moment, no one spoke, and the quiet stretched in a way that felt deliberate, like a test no one had explained. Then, slowly, the figure lowered their head, not dramatically, not ceremonially, just enough to shift the entire atmosphere of the room. The others followed, one after another, until the sound of metal moving in unison became the only thing breaking the silence. Ethan blinked once. "Okay," he murmured, barely audible. "That is new." He had expected questions, possibly accusations, maybe a request for identification he would fail to provide in a satisfying way. He had not expected this. The lead figure spoke then, their voice filtered through a modulation system that smoothed out any trace of individuality. "Your Highness," they said, and the words did not echo, but they did settle into the room with a kind of weight that suggested they belonged there. Ethan felt something shift, not in the room exactly, but in the way the situation arranged itself around that single phrase. "Highness." He looked down at the woman, then back at the line of armored figures, then back at her again, as if repetition might improve clarity. "I am starting to feel like I missed an important detail," he said quietly. Her eyes flicked to him, and for a fraction of a second, something almost like amusement crossed her expression, quickly hidden beneath composure that now felt less like effort and more like default. "You missed several," she replied. The lead figure stepped closer, precise, controlled, stopping just short of the table, their posture unchanged except for the angle of their head, which remained lowered in acknowledgement. "We have been searching for you," they continued, the modulation in their voice failing to hide the underlying urgency. "The fleet has been in active sweep for 48 hours. Your signal was lost." Ethan glanced at the woman again, slower this time, his brain adjusting its expectations in small, reluctant increments. "Your signal," he repeated under his breath, as if testing the phrase for structural integrity. Her hand finally released his wrist, but only so she could push herself upright, the movement measured, deliberate, as if she were reminding the room of something it had temporarily forgotten. The faint sheen of her skin caught the overhead lights now that most of the mud had been cleared, revealing subtle patterns beneath the surface that shifted almost imperceptibly, like circuitry deciding whether to reveal itself. The effect was not dramatic. It was worse. It was undeniable. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight. Not louder, not harsher, just final. "Stand down," she said, and the command did not need repetition. Every armored figure straightened instantly, their formation adjusting in a single fluid motion. Ethan watched this happen with the quiet fascination of someone observing a system far more advanced than anything he had ever repaired. "Right?" he said after a moment, because silence was starting to feel like a commitment he was not ready to make. "So you are important." Her gaze returned to him, steady, unblinking. "That is one way to describe it," she said. Ethan nodded slowly. "Good," he replied, "because I just washed you with a standard maintenance hose, and I would like to know how much trouble that is going to cause me." For the first time since the soldiers arrived, the room shifted again, not through movement, but through attention, every gaze turning toward him with a focus that suggested he had just said something historically relevant. The woman did not look away. "That depends," she said softly, "on whether I decide it was a mistake." The silence after her words did not feel empty. It felt organized, like every person in the room had been given a script and was now waiting for the next line to be delivered by someone who had just rewritten the scene without asking. Ethan remained where he was, one hand still damp from the water he had used, trying to calculate exactly how far outside his normal responsibilities this had gone and whether there was a polite way to step back into a version of reality that involved broken engines instead of royal decisions. "I would like to formally clarify," he said after a moment, keeping his tone even, "that I did not know you were important at the time." A faint shift passed through her expression, not quite amusement, not quite irritation, something more measured than either. You were not supposed to, she replied. That was the point. Ethan nodded once, accepting that explanation with the same calm he used when a machine failed for reasons no one could explain. Right, he said. That makes this slightly better. The lead officer stepped forward again, more cautiously this time, as if the space between them had acquired new rules that needed to be respected. Your Highness, they said, the council has been notified. They are requesting immediate confirmation of your status and location. She did not look at them. Her attention remained on Ethan, steady and deliberate in a way that made the rest of the room feel like background noise. They can wait, she said, her voice calm but final. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, which, given their earlier precision, might as well have been a full conversation. Understood, they replied, stepping back into formation. Ethan noticed that. He noticed everything now, because ignoring details no longer felt like a safe option. You just told what looks like a very organized military unit to wait, he said quietly. That seems significant. It is, she answered simply. There was no elaboration, which Ethan suspected was intentional. He had the distinct impression that she was measuring him, not in a hostile way, but in the way someone might evaluate a variable that had not been part of the original equation. It was not uncomfortable exactly. It was just new. She shifted her weight slightly, standing more steadily now, the earlier signs of weakness fading into something controlled and composed. The faint patterns beneath her skin responded to the overhead lights again, subtle lines catching and releasing illumination like a system calibrating itself. Up close, it was difficult to ignore. It was also difficult to categorize, which Ethan found mildly irritating on a professional level. You said they would not let me go, he said after a moment, returning to the part of the conversation that felt the most relevant to his immediate future. I am beginning to understand what you meant. Her gaze sharpened slightly. They will not, she confirmed. Not because of you, but because of what you represent now. Ethan blinked once. I am going to need a more detailed explanation of that, he said. She studied him for a second longer, then glanced briefly at the soldiers, a small, almost invisible signal that carried more authority than any raised voice could have. The formation shifted again, not closer, not farther, but attentive in a different way, as if the situation had moved into a phase that required observation rather than action. You were the first to find me, she said, turning her attention fully back to him. You made contact before my signal was restored, before my identity was confirmed. Ethan considered that, his expression neutral. That still sounds like your problem, he replied. It was, she said. Now it is ours. The distinction settled between them, quiet and unavoidable. Outside, the storm continued to press against the station, but inside, the space around the table had become something else entirely, a focal point where decisions were being made without being announced. Ethan exhaled slowly. I had plans today, he said. They involved fixing a cooling unit and possibly finding better coffee. Her lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something that suggested she understood the concept of ordinary and found it temporarily interesting. Your plans have changed, she said. That seems to be happening a lot, he replied. She took a step closer then, closing the small distance between them with a confidence that did not feel forced, and reached out again, not to restrain him this time, but to rest her hand lightly against his arm, a gesture that was calm, deliberate, and entirely unafraid of the attention it drew. You are coming with me, she said. It was not a request. Ethan looked at her hand, then at her face, then at the line of soldiers who were very carefully pretending not to react. He nodded once, because at this point, arguing felt less like resistance and more like denial. Of course I am, he said. That would be consistent with the rest of my day. The transition from maintenance bay to transport happened with the kind of efficiency that made Ethan feel like a misplaced item being quietly relocated rather than a person making a decision, and he found himself walking beside her through the open doors without remembering exactly when walking had become the only available option. The storm outside had not improved, but the presence of the landed craft had imposed a strange order on it, as if even the wind understood that it was no longer the most important force in the area. The ship itself did not look like something that belonged near a place like this. It was too clean, too precise, its surface reflecting the dim light in a way that suggested it had never once been introduced to inconvenience. Ethan slowed slightly as they approached the ramp, more out of habit than resistance, taking in details the way he always did when confronted with unfamiliar machinery. "I am going to assume," he said quietly, glancing at the seamless hull, "that this is not standard outpost transportation." She did not release his arm. "It is not," she replied. "That is reassuring," he said. "I would hate to discover that I have been commuting incorrectly my entire life." The soldiers moved around them in coordinated silence, forming a corridor that guided them forward without ever making physical contact, a choreography that felt practiced to the point of instinct. Ethan noticed how none of them stepped between him and her, how their positioning adjusted subtly to accommodate that single constant. It was not accidental. He filed that away. Inside, the air shifted immediately, the faint metallic scent of the outpost replaced by something cleaner, controlled, like the ship had opinions about contamination and enforced them quietly. The lighting adjusted as they entered, softening just enough to make the space feel less like a machine and more like an environment designed for people who expected comfort without asking for it. Ethan glanced around, taking in the smooth walls, the absence of visible seams, the way the floor responded almost imperceptibly to his weight, compensating in ways that felt almost polite. "I prefer my gravity honest," he muttered under his breath. She heard him. "Of course she did. You will adapt," she said. "That is what everyone tells me right before things get worse," he replied. She did not comment on that, but there was a slight shift at the corner of her mouth that suggested the statement had been evaluated and stored for later consideration. They moved deeper into the ship, passing through a series of corridors that seemed to anticipate their movement, doors opening before they reached them, systems adjusting without visible input. Ethan had worked around enough automated systems to recognize the difference between responsive and predictive, and this leaned heavily toward the latter. It made him feel like the ship knew where he was going before he did, which was not a comforting realization. "So," he said after a moment, because silence felt like it was becoming too meaningful to ignore, "you are a princess." He said it the way one might say you are a technician, or you are responsible for this, testing the word for weight rather than drama. She glanced at him briefly, then forward again. "Yes," she said. No elaboration. No correction. Just confirmation. Ethan nodded slowly. "That tracks," he said. "I had a feeling this was not going to be a normal day." They entered a larger chamber then, one that felt less like a corridor and more like a destination, the space opening up with a quiet authority that made it clear this was where decisions were expected to happen. The soldiers remained near the entrance, their presence constant but unobtrusive, as if they understood that whatever came next did not require their immediate involvement. She released his arm at last, stepping a few feet away, turning to face him fully for the first time since they had left the bay. Without the mud, without the dim lighting, without the chaos of the storm, there was no ambiguity left in her appearance. The faint patterns beneath her skin were more visible now, subtle lines that shifted with her movement, catching the light in ways that felt intentional rather than decorative. Her posture was straight, controlled, every movement measured without appearing forced. She looked exactly like what the soldiers had called her. Ethan took that in, then exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "I am going to need to know why I am here." Her gaze held his, steady, assessing, but not unkind. "Because you found me first," she said. Ethan nodded once. "We have established that," he replied. "I am asking why that matters." There was a brief pause, not hesitation, but consideration, as if she were deciding how much of the answer he was ready to hear. Then she stepped closer. Again, closing the distance with the same quiet certainty as before. "Because in my world," she said softly, "first contact is never just an accident." The words settled into the space between them, quiet but definitive, and Ethan had the distinct feeling that whatever definition of normal he had been holding on to had just been formally retired without notice. The words did not feel dramatic when she said them, which somehow made them worse, because Ethan had learned that the most important things were usually delivered without ceremony, like a system warning that appeared quietly just before everything stopped working. He considered her statement for a moment, turning it over the way he would a problem that did not yet have enough data to justify a solution. "First contact," he repeated, as if saying it out loud might make it sound less significant. In my experience, that usually involves paperwork and someone explaining protocols I will not remember. She watched him closely, her expression unreadable in a way that did not feel cold, just controlled, like she had long ago decided which reactions were worth showing and which were not. For us, she said, it determines alignment. Ethan nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he was still negotiating with the concept. Alignment, he echoed. That sounds like something that becomes my problem very quickly. A faint shift in her posture suggested agreement, though she did not confirm it directly. Instead, she turned slightly, her attention moving toward one of the walls where a panel had illuminated without being touched, responding to her presence with the quiet efficiency of a system that did not require instruction. Data began to form across its surface, lines and symbols that meant nothing to Ethan but arranged themselves with a confidence that suggested they meant everything to someone else. When my signal was lost, she continued, the system entered a contingency state. It began recording all external interactions from the moment of impact. Ethan followed her gaze, studying the panel with the same practical focus he applied to unfamiliar machinery. So somewhere in there, he said, there is a very detailed account of me using a maintenance hose on someone who outranks me by several levels. Yes, she replied. That is correct. He exhaled through his nose. Good, he said. I always wanted my career to include historical documentation. The panel shifted again, isolating a specific segment of data that pulsed faintly, drawing attention without explanation. She stepped closer to it, then paused, her hand hovering just short of the surface, as if the next action required more than simple confirmation. Ethan noticed that hesitation, subtle as it was. That part seems important, he said. She glanced at him briefly. It is, she said. Then she touched the panel. The display changed immediately, the abstract patterns resolving into something more structured, more focused, and though Ethan did not understand the specifics, he recognized the moment for what it was, the way the room seemed to narrow its attention, the way the silence adjusted, becoming more deliberate, more precise. A soft tone filled the space, not loud, not intrusive, just present, like a system acknowledging that a threshold had been crossed. Primary contact identified. A voice said, calm and neutral, carrying no emotion but a clear sense of finality. Ethan did not move. He did not need to. He had a strong suspicion about where this was going, and moving would not improve the outcome. The display shifted again, and this time there was no ambiguity. His image appeared, captured from the bay, mid-action, water in his hand, expression somewhere between concentration and mild annoyance. Ethan stared at it for a second, then tilted his head slightly. That is not my best angle, he said. She did not respond to that. Her attention remained on the display, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle tension in the way she held herself now, as if the system had just confirmed something she had expected but still needed to verify. Contact registered prior to identity restoration, the voice continued. Protocol designation, binding interaction. Ethan blinked once. I am sorry, he said carefully. Did it just say binding? She turned to face him again, and this time there was no distance. In her gaze, no abstraction, just direct focus, clear and unambiguous. Yes, she said. It did. He considered that, his mind running through possibilities, most of which he immediately rejected as unrealistic, which left only the ones that were significantly worse. And binding means, he prompted. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then answered in the same calm, measured tone she had used from the beginning, as if the weight of the statement did not require adjustment. It means, she said, that the system recognizes you as the first point of contact with royal authority. Ethan nodded once, absorbing that with the same steady composure he had maintained through the rest of the day, even as the implications began to arrange themselves into something far more complex than he preferred. Right, he said quietly, and I am guessing that is not something I can opt out of. Her expression softened, just slightly, not enough to change the overall composure, but enough to suggest that she understood the question beneath the question. No, she said, it is not. The system dimmed slightly, as if the confirmation had completed its purpose, but the effect remained, settling into the room with a quiet certainty that did not require repetition. Ethan glanced at the display one more time, then back at her, And for the first time since this had started, he allowed himself a small, thoughtful pause. I should have stayed with the cooling unit, he said. She almost smiled. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the ship, not the soldiers at the far end of the chamber, not even the subtle hum beneath Ethan's feet, as if the entire system had reached a conclusion and was now waiting to see how he would respond to it. Ethan considered the panel one last time, then looked back at her, his expression calm in the way it always became when the situation stopped making sense and started becoming permanent. So, he said slowly, just to make sure I am understanding this correctly, I helped you. The system recorded it, and now that help has been upgraded to something official. She did not look away. Yes, she said. That is an accurate summary. Ethan nodded once. Good, he replied. I like when my mistakes are well documented. A faint shift passed through her posture again, that almost smile returning for just a fraction of a second before discipline replaced it. She turned slightly toward the panel, then back to him, as if confirming that the data had not changed in the last few seconds. It had not. Systems like this did not revise themselves based on preference. It is not a mistake, she said. It is a designation. Ethan tilted his head. Those two things tend to overlap in my experience, he said. She stepped closer again, reducing the distance between them until the space felt less like a chamber and more like a conversation that had narrowed down to its essential variables. In our structure, she said, designation determines access, authority, and proximity. Ethan let that settle for a moment, his mind moving through the implications with the same steady logic he used when diagnosing a malfunction. Proximity, he repeated quietly. That sounds like the part that becomes my problem. It is, she confirmed. Behind them, the soldiers remained still, but Ethan could feel the shift in their attention, not toward the panel anymore, but toward him, as if the system's confirmation had reassigned their priorities without requiring further instruction. He had been in rooms where he was ignored, dismissed, tolerated, but this was new. This was a room adjusting itself around him, not because of who he was, but because of what had just been decided about him. I assume, he said, glancing briefly toward the doorway and the silent figures stationed there, that this changes how they see me. It does, she said. And how you see me, he added. That question lingered for a fraction longer, not avoided, but measured. When she answered, her voice was the same, controlled, precise, but there was something beneath it now, something quieter. That was already changing, she said. Ethan absorbed that without reacting outwardly, though internally he made a note to revisit that statement later, when the situation was less immediate. He exhaled slowly. All right, he said. Then I am going to need to understand the rules of this designation before I accidentally violate them. She studied him again, not evaluating his words this time, but something deeper, as if she were confirming that his approach to the problem matched what she needed it to be. You will not be treated as a civilian, she said. You will not be processed through standard channels. And you will not be allowed to leave until the council reviews your status. Ethan nodded. That last part was implied, he said. I appreciate the confirmation. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the response, then moved past him toward the center of the chamber, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly as she did, the composure of recovery giving way to something more defined, more aligned with the role the soldiers had already recognized. Ethan watched that transition happen in real time, the difference subtle but unmistakable. This was not someone becoming important. This was someone returning to it. We are leaving the outpost, she said, not looking back, her voice carrying through the space with quiet authority. The soldiers responded immediately, movement precise, coordinated, the ship itself seeming to acknowledge the command with a slight shift in its underlying systems. Ethan glanced around once more, the chamber, the panel, the place where his image still lingered in the system's memory, and then back at her. And I am coming with you, he said. It was not a question. She turned her head just enough to meet his gaze again, her expression steady, certain. Yes, she said. Ethan nodded once, accepting that with the same calm he had carried through everything else, even as the weight of it settled more firmly into place. All right, he said quietly. Then I would like to formally state that I did not plan for any of this. She held his gaze for a moment longer, and this time, the almost smile did not disappear as quickly. Neither did I, she said. The ship shifted then, not dramatically, but enough for Ethan to feel it, a subtle change in orientation, in intent, as if the entire structure had just committed to a direction that did not include turning back. And for the first time since this began, Ethan had the distinct and undeniable sense that whatever came next was not going to be something he could quietly step away from. The moment the ship committed to motion, Ethan felt it less as movement and more as a decision, a quiet shift in gravity and direction that suggested the entire structure had agreed on a future without consulting him, which he found deeply consistent with the rest of his day. He adjusted his stance slightly, letting the floor compensate for him in a way that felt unnervingly cooperative, and glanced toward the chamber walls as the faint hum beneath them deepened, no longer idle, no longer waiting. "I assume," he said, watching the subtle change in light as the ship reoriented itself, "this is the part where leaving becomes significantly more difficult." "It already was," she replied, her voice steady as she moved toward a central console that had come alive in response to her proximity. Data unfolded across its surface in layered patterns, more complex than before, more active, as if the system itself had transitioned from observation to execution. Ethan followed at a measured pace, not because he was trying to keep up, but because staying still no longer felt like a viable strategy. "Right," he said. "I appreciate the honesty." She did not look back, but there was a slight tilt of her head that suggested she had acknowledged the comment. Around them, the chamber adjusted in subtle ways, lighting shifting to match the new trajectory, displays updating in quiet synchronization, everything aligning with a purpose that did not require explanation. Ethan noticed how the soldiers had repositioned again, no longer guarding an entrance, but forming a wider perimeter, one that included him without isolating him, a distinction that felt deliberate. He filed that away as well. "So this council," he continued after a moment, because silence had once again started to carry too much weight, "they are going to review my status." "Yes," she said. "And decide what I am," he added. This time, she paused, her hand hovering over the console before she turned slightly, her attention returning to him with a focus that felt more personal than procedural. "They will try," she said. Ethan considered that. "That does not sound reassuring," he replied. "It is not meant to be," she said. There was no hostility in her tone, just clarity, the kind that did not soften itself for comfort. Ethan nodded once, accepting that with the same steady composure he had maintained since the beginning. "Good," he said. "I prefer accurate over reassuring." She studied him for a moment longer, and this time the assessment felt different, less about classification and more about confirmation, as if she were checking something against an internal expectation that had not been fully defined until now. "You are adapting quickly," she said. Ethan exhaled quietly. "I have had a lot of practice with situations that do not ask for permission," he replied. "This one just happens to be larger." A faint shift passed through her expression again, that almost smile returning for a fraction longer this time before settling back into composure. "Yes," she said. "It is." The ship's hum deepened again, and through a narrow viewport along the far wall, Ethan caught a glimpse of the outpost shrinking beneath them, the storm still raging but already distant, already less relevant. He watched it for a second, the place where his day had started now reduced to a point on the surface, and felt a quiet, almost detached realization settle in. There was no returning to that version of normal. Not after this. "You said this was a designation," he said, turning back to her. "Access, authority, proximity." "Yes," she confirmed. "And what does that look like in practice?" he asked, for someone who was fixing a cooling unit an hour ago. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped away from the console and moved back toward him, closing the distance once more with that same quiet certainty, until they stood within arm's reach again, the rest of the chamber fading into a kind of controlled background. When she spoke, her voice was softer, but no less precise. "It means," she said, "that you will be seen." Ethan blinked once. "I have spent most of my life avoiding that," he said. "I am aware," she replied. That stopped him for a fraction of a second, not enough to show, but enough to register. "That sounds like you have more information about me than I do about you," he said. Her gaze held his, steady, unflinching. "I have enough," she said. The statement lingered between them, quiet but loaded, and for the first time since the system had confirmed his status, Ethan felt something shift that was not external, not procedural, but personal. And you, he said slowly, are you going to let them decide what I am? This time, there was no pause. No, she said. The certainty in that single word did not raise her voice, did not change her posture, but it altered the space between them in a way that was impossible to ignore. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if accepting a conclusion he had not yet fully understood. All right, he said quietly. Then I suppose I will need to understand what you have already decided. She held his gaze, and for the first time since the storm, since the mud, since the moment he had found her, there was no distance left in it at all. You will, she said. And the way she said it made it clear that whatever that understanding was, it was not something he would be given the option to refuse. The certainty in her voice did not fade after she said it. It settled instead, like something that had already been decided long before this moment, and was only now being acknowledged out loud. And Ethan, who had spent most of his life avoiding being part of anything irreversible, found himself standing in the exact center of something that had clearly moved past the point of negotiation. He held her gaze for a second longer, not challenging it, not accepting it completely either, just measuring it the way he measured everything that might eventually become his responsibility. That sounds like a decision, he said quietly. It is, she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no adjustment, just a direct confirmation that made the rest of the room feel like it had been waiting for that single alignment to finalize. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing past her toward the viewport again, where the outpost had fully disappeared now, replaced by open space that stretched in every direction. With the kind of indifference that made personal problems feel both smaller and significantly more permanent at the same time. Then I should probably understand what comes next, he said. She turned slightly, not away from him, but enough to include the rest of the chamber again, the systems, the soldiers, the ship itself, as if the answer to that question was not contained in a single explanation, but in everything surrounding them. Next, she said, you are presented. Ethan blinked once. Presented, he repeated. That sounds formal. It is, she said. You will stand before the council, and they will assess what the system has already confirmed. Ethan nodded slowly. And they will not like that, he said. This time, she did not answer immediately, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was precise, like a calculation that had already been completed but was still being considered for accuracy. They will not understand it, she said at last, which is not the same as not liking it, but often leads to similar outcomes. Ethan tilted his head slightly. That is a very diplomatic way of saying I am going to be a problem, he said. You already are, she replied, and for the first time, the almost smile stayed just a fraction longer, enough to make the statement feel less like a warning and more like a recognition. He considered that, then nodded once, accepting it with the same steady composure he had carried through everything else. All right, he said. Then I will do what I always do when I am a problem. She studied him, that focused attention returning, sharper now, more intent. And that is, she prompted. Ethan shrugged slightly, a small, controlled movement that carried more familiarity than confidence. I stay useful, he said. The words hung in the air for a second, simple, unembellished, but solid in a way that did not require explanation. Something in her expression shifted at that, not visibly to anyone else in the room, but enough that Ethan noticed it, the way her posture adjusted, the way her attention settled rather than moved. That may be the only reason this works, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Then we should probably make sure it does, he replied. The ship adjusted again, a subtle change in trajectory that felt more precise now, more directed, as if the destination ahead had just become more than a location and less than a choice. Around them, the chamber responded in quiet synchronization, displays shifting, systems aligning, everything moving towards something that had not yet been revealed but was already influencing the present. Ethan looked at her again, really looked this time, not as a variable in a problem, not as someone he had accidentally helped, but as the center of a structure that extended far beyond this ship, far beyond this moment, and he realized, with a calm that surprised even him, that whatever came next was not just about being pulled into her world. It was about being seen by it. So, he said after a moment, his voice steady, grounded in the only thing he still recognized. When we get there, what do I call you? She met his gaze without hesitation, the answer immediate, precise, and carrying the full weight of everything he had just stepped into. "You call me Lyra," she said. And then, after the smallest pause, the kind that changed meaning without changing tone, she added, "And you do not stand behind me." The statement settled into the space between them with quiet authority, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that redefined the position he occupied without asking for his agreement. Ethan nodded once, accepting that with the same calm he had carried through the storm, through the silence, through every shift that had led him here. "All right," he said, "then I guess we will see what happens when I do not." And somewhere beyond the walls of the ship, beyond the reach of the storm he had left behind, something vast and organized was already waiting for him to find out.